Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power, by Jon Meacham. Picture this: February 1801, dead of winter. Washington is barely more than a glorified mud pit, and right now it's frozen in place by a vicious snowstorm and an even nastier political crisis. In a modest boarding house, just a stone's throw from the half-built Capitol, a lanky red-haired Virginian is pacing the floorboards. He's just won one of the ugliest presidential races in American history, defeating the sitting president, John Adams. But here's the twist. A bizarre constitutional glitch has created a tie, not with Adams, but with his own running mate, Aaron Burr. Now the whole mess lands in the House of Representatives, where the very people who despise him most will decide whether he becomes president or not. The rumors swirling through the frozen streets are wild: military coup, civil war, the collapse of the entire American experiment before it even gets going. And right at the center of this maelstrom sits Thomas Jefferson, trying to keep his composure, while everything he's worked for hangs by a thread. How does someone end up in a pressure cooker like this? What kind of journey shapes a person to face the possible destruction of their country? And here's the really fascinating part. How do you learn the skills, the craft, the art, not just to survive that moment, but to triumph, and to create an entire era that will carry your name into history? That's the riveting journey we're about to take, guided by Pulitzer Prize winner Jon Meacham and his brilliant work, Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power. This isn't your typical dusty biography. It's an exploration of leadership, hunger for power, and the messy, very human truth of how power is grabbed, used, and held onto. By the time we're done, you'll see the secret to Jefferson's success. He was a dreamer who got really, really good at playing the game. He was a philosopher who knew how to throw a punch. And his story is packed with lessons about turning big, beautiful ideas into real, lasting change. To understand the man facing that 1801 crisis, we need to rewind way back to the rough edges of Virginia, long before revolution was even a possibility. Jefferson's story doesn't start with books and philosophy. It starts with raw strength. His father, Peter Jefferson, was practically a folk hero on the Virginia frontier. A self-made surveyor and mapmaker, Peter was famous for his almost superhuman power. The stories people told claimed he could single-handedly tear down structures that 3 enslaved men working together couldn't budge. He was a man who bent the wilderness to his will, and he taught his son that leadership required strength, physical and mental. But there's another thread to this story. Jefferson's mother, Jane Randolph, came from one of Virginia's most elite aristocratic families. Through her, Jefferson inherited connections to a world of luxury, sophistication, and serious political clout. So from day one, Thomas Jefferson embodied a paradox. He was frontier toughness and plantation aristocracy. He was self-made determination and inherited privilege. This tension between the ideal of the everyday citizen and the reality of the elite would run through everything he ever did. His real transformation came through education. He landed at the College of William and Mary in Williamsburg, colonial Virginia's buzzing capital. And that's where his universe expanded. He found himself surrounded by extraordinary mentors. There was William Small, a brilliant scientist who introduced him to Enlightenment thinking, teaching him that reason, not blind tradition, should guide human decisions. Then George Wythe, Virginia's top lawyer, took Jefferson under his wing for 5 intense years, training him to think with precision and power. And perhaps most remarkably, the royal governor himself, Francis Fauquier, invited this young student to intimate dinners at the governor's palace. There, Jefferson would discuss philosophy, science, and politics with the colony's most influential figures. He'd play violin in the evenings, absorbing the atmosphere of refinement and authority. This was his graduate school in power. He wasn't just reading about it in books. He was watching it up close, learning how it worked, developing an appetite for it. But for all his intellectual firepower, Jefferson had one glaring weakness. He was absolutely terrible at public speaking. He despised confrontation. His voice was thin, and he'd freeze up in front of crowds. Early on, he developed a crush on a young woman named Rebecca Burwell. He planned this grand, romantic declaration at a dance. He rehearsed endlessly, dressed to impress, and when the moment arrived, he completely fell apart. Stammering, barely coherent, utterly humiliated. It was painful, but it taught him something crucial. His power wouldn't flow from the thunder of his oratory, but from the sharp precision of his writing. He discovered he could move people and shape events far more effectively with a pen than he ever could with his voice. This realization would reshape his life and, ultimately, American history. Meanwhile, the wider world was shifting. Britain, drowning in war debt, started squeezing its American colonies harder. Taxes like the Stamp Act weren't just about revenue, they were about control. And in Williamsburg, the young lawyer Jefferson had a ringside seat. He stood in the doorway of the House of Burgesses and witnessed a fiery, rough-edged speaker named Patrick Henry deliver a speech that electrified the colonies. Tarquin and Caesar had their Brutus. Henry roared, comparing King George to ancient tyrants, Charles I his Cromwell, and George III. He paused dramatically, and the chamber exploded. "Treason!" the speaker shouted. Jefferson was absolutely mesmerized. He said Henry spoke, as Homer wrote. In that moment, the abstract ideas of liberty he'd been reading about became urgent, real, and dangerous. But he also absorbed a subtler political lesson. The next day, after Henry had left town, the more cautious, establishment politicians skillfully maneuvered to undo Henry's most radical resolutions. Jefferson watched, fascinated. He realized that passion and eloquence were powerful tools, but incomplete. To truly win, you needed strategy, patience, and mastery of the rules. You had to know when to push, when to yield, and how to outmaneuver your opponents. It was a masterclass in the art of power that stuck with him forever. As the conflict with Britain intensified, Jefferson sharpened his greatest weapon. In 1774, he wrote a powerful pamphlet called A Summary View of the Rights of British America. It was bold, eloquent, and radical. It made him famous overnight. It also put him on London's watch list as a dangerous agitator. Then came 1776. The colonies were at war. In Philadelphia, the Continental Congress was debating the ultimate gamble: independence. They needed a document, a declaration explaining their reasoning to the world. They formed a committee, but who should do the actual writing? John Adams, the passionate patriot from Massachusetts, knew it shouldn't be him. He was too abrasive, too polarizing. He turned to the quiet 33-year-old Virginian. "Why me?" Jefferson asked. Adams gave him 3 reasons. First, you are a Virginian, and a Virginian ought to appear at the head of this business. Second, I am obnoxious, suspected, and unpopular. You are very much otherwise. And the third, you can write 10 times better than I can. So in a rented Philadelphia room, Jefferson sat down to write. He wasn't trying to invent radical new philosophy. His goal, he explained, was to create an expression of the American mind. He drew on the ideas of John Locke and the Enlightenment thinkers he'd studied with his mentors, distilling them into something simple, powerful, and eternal. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. With those words, he gave a new nation its soul, but even this masterpiece required political compromise. His original draft included a fierce attack on the slave trade, blaming King George for forcing slavery on the colonies, but the Southern delegates wouldn't stand for it. To keep the fragile Union together, the passage was deleted. Jefferson sat there, pained, as his colleagues dissected his words. It was another hard lesson in the gap between what should be and what is. The high of 1776 crashed into the lowest point of Jefferson's public life. He was elected governor of Virginia right as the war came home, with the British deciding to invade. The state was woefully unprepared. The government had little money and a weak militia. Jefferson, a man far more comfortable in his library than on a battlefield, was overwhelmed. In 1781, British forces under the traitor Benedict Arnold tore through Virginia. Jefferson and the state legislature had to flee Richmond in chaos. British cavalry, led by the ruthless Banastre Tarleton, even raided Monticello itself. Jefferson famously escaped mere minutes before they arrived, a flight his enemies would never let him forget, forever branding him a coward who abandoned his post. The Virginia legislature launched an inquiry into his conduct. Though eventually cleared, the experience cut him deeply. He wrote that the accusation had inflicted a wound on my spirit, which will only be cured by the all-healing grave. This public humiliation was compounded by unbearable private tragedy. His wife Martha, whom he absolutely adored, had been weakened by 6 pregnancies in 10 years. Her health collapsed. For 4 agonizing months in 1782, Jefferson never left her bedside. He was her constant caretaker, reading to her, holding her hand, watching her slip away. As she lay dying, she made him promise never to remarry, never to place her children under the care of a stepmother. He gave his word. When she died, Jefferson collapsed. He fainted and stayed unconscious so long his family feared he too would die. For 3 weeks, he locked himself in his room, pacing endlessly, a solitary figure consumed by grief. When he finally emerged, he'd mount his horse and ride for hours through the woods, with only his young daughter Patsy as witness to his waves of sorrow. He felt his world had ended, but a new one was about to open up. Seeking escape from his grief, Jefferson accepted a position he'd previously declined. He would go to France as an American minister. Paris was a revelation. It was the dazzling heart of the Enlightenment, a world of art, science, architecture, and revolutionary ideas. For 5 years, he immersed himself. He negotiated treaties, sent back new plants and technologies for America, and engaged with the era's greatest minds. He became a cosmopolitan figure, but also a deeply conflicted one. This was brilliantly captured in a famous letter he wrote after an intense romantic affair with a beautiful, married Anglo-Italian artist named Maria Cosway. The relationship was passionate and all-consuming, and when she left Paris, he was heartbroken. He wrote her a long, extraordinary letter, framed as a dialogue between my head and my heart. His head represents cold, calculating reason. The art of life is the art of avoiding pain. The head scolds. Do not bite at the bait of pleasure till you know there is no hook beneath it. It tells him he was foolish to invest so much emotion in someone he was bound to lose. But his heart fights back. The heart argues that a life lived only by calculation isn't really living at all. To feel deeply, to love, to grieve, that's what makes us human. The most effectual means of being secure against pain, says the head, is to retire within ourselves, but the heart counters. And what more sublime delight than to mingle tears with one whom the hand of heaven hath smitten? In the end, Jefferson gives the final victory to the heart. It was the heart, he writes, not the head, that drove America to revolution. When reason calculated the odds and found them terrible, it was passion that put our existence to the hazard, and we saved our country. During these years in Paris, another, far more secret and consequential relationship began. After one of his young daughters died back in Virginia, Jefferson sent for his youngest, Polly, to join him. Accompanying her was a teenage enslaved girl named Sally Hemings. Sally was his late wife Martha's half-sister. She was about 14, and by all accounts, beautiful. In Paris, different rules applied. Under French law, Sally could have claimed her freedom, and as Jefferson prepared to return to America, she did something extraordinary. Pregnant with his child, she refused to go back to Virginia, where she would be re-enslaved. For perhaps the first time in his life, Jefferson found himself in a negotiation where he didn't hold all the cards. He, the master, had to bargain with her, the enslaved. According to the account of their son, Madison Hemings, Jefferson made her a solemn pledge. If she returned with him, he would free all their children when they reached 21. She agreed. It was a secret treaty, a private pact that would shape the rest of his life and cast a long shadow over his legacy. When Jefferson returned to America in 1789, he walked straight into a nation having a profound argument with itself. The new Constitution was in place, George Washington was president, but two radically different visions for the country's future were colliding. On one side stood Alexander Hamilton, the brilliant and fiercely ambitious Secretary of the Treasury. Hamilton believed in a powerful central government, a national bank, and an economy driven by manufacturing and finance, all modeled on Britain. He believed the wealthy and well-educated were society's natural leaders, and that common people couldn't be trusted. At a dinner party, Jefferson recalled Hamilton declaring that the British government was the most perfect model of government that could be formed. When Jefferson pointed to portraits of his own heroes, the philosophers Bacon, Locke, and Newton, Hamilton paused, then declared that the greatest man that ever lived was Julius Caesar. On the other side stood Jefferson. As Washington's Secretary of State, he was horrified by what he witnessed. He believed Hamilton and his Federalist allies, whom he called monocrats, were betraying the Revolution's spirit. He saw their financial system as a corruption machine, designed to enrich speculators and tie America's interests to Britain. He feared they were slowly, subtly steering America back toward monarchy. The two men were, as Jefferson later put it, pitted against each other every day in the cabinet like two cocks in a pit. But Jefferson was too savvy to fight Hamilton head-on, so he worked behind the scenes. In one of American history's most famous compromises, Jefferson hosted a dinner party with Hamilton and James Madison. Over wine, they struck a deal. Jefferson and Madison would let Hamilton's controversial plan for the federal government to assume state debts go through. In exchange, Hamilton would use his influence to ensure the permanent national capital would be on the Potomac River, a victory for the South. It was vintage Jefferson, a quiet conversation, a pragmatic bargain, a monumental outcome. He also pioneered opposition politics in a new way. He secretly funded a Republican newspaper, run by the poet Philip Freneau, to counter the pro-Hamilton press. He wrote letters, encouraged allies, and quietly built a political party from the ground up, all while publicly claiming to be above partisan politics. The battle for the Republic's soul reached fever pitch during John Adams's presidency. The nation teetered on the brink of war with France, and in a climate of fear and paranoia, the Federalists passed the Alien and Sedition Acts. These laws gave the president sweeping new powers to deport foreigners, and, most alarmingly, made it a crime to write, print, utter, or publish anything false or malicious about the government. To Jefferson, this was pure tyranny. It was final proof that the Federalists were determined to crush liberty. He called it a, quote, reign of witches. Republican newspaper editors were arrested. A congressman was jailed for criticizing the president. It was a dark time, setting the stage for the epic presidential showdown of 1800. And so we circle back to where we began, that tense winter in Washington, the nation holding its breath. The Jefferson-Burr tie wasn't just a constitutional crisis. It was the climax of a decade-long war over America's future. The Federalists, in their final gasp of power, saw an opening. They could deny Jefferson the presidency by backing the more malleable Aaron Burr, or they could try to prevent any election and appoint an interim president. For 35 ballots in the House of Representatives, the deadlock held. State delegations were split. Men slept on cots in the Capitol. The country edged toward chaos. But Alexander Hamilton, Jefferson's great adversary, made a fateful decision. He despised Jefferson's politics, but he feared Burr even more. He saw Burr as a man without principles, driven by dangerous ambition. Jefferson, Hamilton, believed, for all his radical ideas, had a, quote, pretension to character. He was a man of principles, however flawed. To my mind, Hamilton wrote, Jefferson is by far not so dangerous a man. Hamilton used his influence to persuade key Federalists to break the deadlock. On the 36th ballot, February 17, 1801, Thomas Jefferson became the third President of the United States. It was what he called the Revolution of 1800. It was a peaceful transfer of power from one party to another, something that had rarely happened in human history. In his inaugural address, he worked to heal the nation's wounds. "We have called by different names brethren of the same principle," he declared. "We are all Republicans. We are all Federalists." It was a masterstroke of political leadership, a call for unity after a decade of bitter division. As president, Jefferson governed with a quiet but iron hand. He shocked his opponents not by demolishing the government, but by mastering it. His greatest triumph was the Louisiana Purchase in 1803. When Napoleon, bogged down in Europe, offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory, a massive expanse that would double the country's size, Jefferson faced a dilemma. The Constitution said nothing about the federal government having power to acquire new territory. As a strict constitutionalist, he believed he had no authority to make the deal. But he was also a pragmatist. This was an opportunity that might never return. It would secure the nation's western border and create what he called an empire of liberty for generations. So he set aside his constitutional qualms. He made the deal. It was a stunning example of what Jon Meacham calls using, quote, Hamiltonian means to achieve Jeffersonian ends. He wielded central government power in ways Hamilton could only have dreamed of, but in service of his vision of an agrarian republic. He immediately sent Meriwether Lewis and William Clark on their legendary expedition to explore the new territory and find a route to the Pacific. It was an act of scientific curiosity and geopolitical ambition, a perfect expression of the Jeffersonian mind. His second term, however, was far rougher. With Britain and France locked in mortal combat, American shipping got caught in the crossfire. Desperate to avoid war, Jefferson pushed through the Embargo Act of 1807. It was a radical experiment. He shut down all American trade with the outside world, hoping economic pressure would force Britain and France to respect American neutrality. It was a disaster. The embargo crippled the American economy, especially New England, and did virtually nothing to change British or French policy. It was a massive overreach of federal power, far exceeding the Alien and Sedition Acts he'd so fiercely opposed. The man who believed in limited government was now policing every ship in every harbor. It was a painful lesson in power's limits. After 8 years, Jefferson followed Washington's example and walked away from the presidency, retiring to his beloved Monticello. For the final 17 years of his life, he was the Sage of Monticello, an American icon. He filled his days with his passions: architecture, farming, science, and endless correspondence. He sold his magnificent library to the government after the British burned the Capitol in the War of 1812, forming the foundation of the modern Library of Congress. He devoted his final years to one last great project, founding the University of Virginia. It was the culmination of his life's belief in reason and education's power. He designed the campus, planned the curriculum, recruited the faculty. It was, he said, to be an institution based on the illimitable freedom of the human mind. In these final years, he also reconciled with his old friend and rival John Adams. Their correspondence is one of American history's treasures. They wrote about everything: philosophy, religion, history, their triumphs, regrets, and hopes for the nation they'd helped create. "You and I ought not to die," Adams wrote, "before we have explained ourselves to each other." But even in retirement, Jefferson couldn't escape his life's great, unresolved contradiction: slavery. He called it a hideous blot and a moral and political depravity. He knew it was wrong, and he feared it would one day rip the nation apart. The Missouri Compromise of 1820, which drew a geographical line between free and slave states, sounded to him like a fire bell in the night, the knell of the Union. "We have the wolf by the ear," he wrote, "and we can neither hold him nor safely let him go. Justice is in one scale, and self-preservation in the other." And so the man who declared that all men are created equal lived and died a master of more than 600 enslaved people. He made his private peace, keeping his promise to Sally Hemings and quietly freeing their children. But he failed to lead the nation toward a public solution. It was his life's great tragedy, a failure of both his head and his heart. As he grew older, he kept his eye on the calendar. He wanted to live to see the 50th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. As the day approached in the summer of 1826, he was weak and bedridden. In his final hours, his mind drifted back to the Revolution. "Warn the committee to be on the alert," he murmured. On the evening of July 3rd, he asked, "Is it the 4th?" "Not yet," he was told. He held on through the night. On July 4th, 1826, 50 years to the day after his words had given birth to a nation, Thomas Jefferson died. Hundreds of miles away in Massachusetts, John Adams lay on his own deathbed. His last words were, "Thomas Jefferson survives." And in so many ways, he was absolutely right. So what do we take from this incredible life, this journey through a nation's birth? Jon Meacham's great achievement in the art of power is showing us that Thomas Jefferson wasn't a marble statue. He wasn't simply a hypocrite or a saint. He was a deeply human leader, full of contradictions, wrestling with the same fundamental conflict we all face, the gap between the world as it is and the world as we wish it could be. The most powerful lesson for me is Jefferson's pragmatism. He was a man of soaring ideals, but he never let idealism blind him to reality. He believed in limited government, but when the chance arose to double the nation's size with the Louisiana Purchase, he grabbed it, stretching the Constitution to its limits. He hated public speaking, so he mastered writing. He feared monarchy, but he understood that to defeat it, he had to build a political party and fight for power, even if it meant getting his hands dirty. He teaches us that leadership isn't about purity, it's about effectiveness. It's about understanding that progress is often incremental, that you have to be contented to secure what we can get from time to time, and eternally press forward for what is yet to get. That's a profound insight, especially today, when it's so easy to get frustrated that the world doesn't immediately conform to our ideals. But Meacham also doesn't let Jefferson off the hook. His life is a powerful, often tragic reminder of our capacity for self-deception. The same man who could write with such breathtaking eloquence about liberty could own other human beings. He could father children with an enslaved woman and keep them in bondage for years, all while living in a world of his own design at Monticello. It's a stark lesson that our greatest strengths can coexist with our most profound moral failures. His story forces us to ask uncomfortable questions about our heroes and ourselves. How do we reconcile the good with the bad? How do we judge historical figures trapped in their own time's moral blind spots? I think the best way to start applying Jefferson's wisdom is to embrace his method. First, be a relentless learner. Jefferson's power came from his insatiable curiosity. He studied everything: architecture, science, farming, philosophy, not just for pleasure, but because he believed knowledge was the raw material of power. So today, ask yourself, what's one thing you're curious about that you can spend just 15 minutes learning? Pick up a book on a new topic. Watch a documentary. Start building your own library of ideas. Second, practice the art of quiet influence. Jefferson knew he couldn't win every argument with personality force, so he built relationships. He hosted dinners. He wrote letters. He found common ground. Think about a disagreement you're having right now, big or small. Instead of trying to win the argument, try to understand the other person's perspective. Can you find a small point of agreement to build on? That was the Jeffersonian way. Finally, hold on to your core vision, but be flexible in your tactics. Jefferson's ultimate goal was the success of the American experiment in self-government. That was his North Star. But the path to get there was winding. He compromised. He adapted. He even contradicted himself. He understood that true leadership is about steering the ship, not just drawing the map. That was a summary of Thomas Jefferson, The Art of Power by Jon Meacham. We've really only scratched the surface today. A summary is like looking at a photograph of a great mountain, but reading the book is like making the climb yourself. It's in the quiet moments of reading, when you're deep in a story about a dinner party in Paris or a tense cabinet meeting in Philadelphia, that the real insights emerge. This summary is just a starting point, a way for you to decide if this journey is one you want to take. If anything we've talked about has sparked your curiosity, I can't recommend this book enough. Reading it isn't just about learning history. It's about understanding the very DNA of American leadership and discovering timeless lessons about power, ambition, and the human heart. The link to the book is in the description. Also, if you found this summary valuable, please take a moment to click that like button and subscribe to the channel. It lets me know these deep dives are helpful, and it ensures you won't miss our next exploration of another world-changing book from the billionaire's bookshelf. Let's keep learning and growing together.